Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Lennon, for that very warm introduction. It's very good to be here with you today. Thank you, Dr. Schultz. I am pleased to be in Ohio this beautiful fall day for no other reason than it takes me away from the General Assembly. There are other reasons, too. Ohio in the fall is beautiful. And I, in fact, love getting either to Ohio or to Indiana for some autumn weather. But it's also a pleasure to be away from the General Assembly. I don't get away very often during the period the General Assembly is in session. When I think about my job, I'm reminded of a true story told to me by one of my colleagues who was the ambassador for his country, which shall go unnamed, at the United Nations. He was previously his country's ambassador to NATO, and he served 5 years in that post. And after he had been reassigned to the United Nations, the leading official of NATO organized a dinner for him, and as diplomats are wont, offered a toast at the end of dinner. And in that toast he said, "And now the time has come for us to say goodbye to our dear colleague who must leave the club to join the circus." It is a bit like a tin ring circus at the UN during the General Assembly season, in the sense that there are at least 10 things going on simultaneously. One of those, the most recent actions on Grenada, I'm going to talk a bit about this morning. But I'd like to begin by saying that it's a pleasure to be here, not just because it's fall in Ohio, but also because I am pleased to be here in the capacity as honoring the late John Ashbrook. Even a few years ago, I would have been surprised to find myself speaking at a lecture honoring one of America's leading conservatives. I am something of a convert myself to the conservative cause. I'm one of those people called neo-conservatives, neo in a couple of different senses, not only because it's a new conservatism, but because we're new conservatives. My friend Irving Kristol defined a neo-conservative as a liberal who's been mugged by reality. That's what happened to me. It's what happened to him, and it keeps happening. Events in recent years, in the last decade particularly, quite simply forced me to rethink a good many of my views, not, let me say, my basic values, but my views about how the historical and social processes of our times are relevant to the preservation of my basic views, my basic values, and our country's institutions. I've always been committed to those values and those institutions. I became reluctantly convinced a few years ago that it is a conservative foreign policy, at least, that is required today to protect our liberal democratic society. That liberal democratic society is, of course, under severe challenge from an aggressive, accelerating, progressively dangerous Soviet challenge. I think that it's very important to understand that the liberal democratic tradition of which we are heirs, that tradition which believes that government should be the servant and not the master of people, that believes that ordinary human beings, individuals, are best judge of their own interests and that legitimate government represents those interests as perceived by the individuals themselves. To understand, it's very important for us to understand that those values and those institutions are not only under progressively serious and dangerous challenge, but that the challenger, principal challenger, which is, of course, the Soviet Union, really shares virtually none of our liberal democratic traditions or the values on which that tradition is based, much less the institutions which embody it. Hardest of all, I think, to remember is that although Marxism, because that challenger calls itself Marxist, had some roots in common with the liberal and democratic socialist traditions, Marxism-Leninism and Soviet state power, the political organization through which Marxism-Leninism speaks today, has nothing at all in common with our liberal democratic tradition. It is related to our tradition as antithesis to thesis. It does not incorporate either the theory or the practice of liberalism or democracy or socialism. It denies all the essential elements of Western liberal democratic socialist traditions. It sees classes, not individuals, as the motor and creative principle of history. It postulates, advocates, and justifies violence as the method of historical change. It spawns governments based on one-party dictatorship, not on the consent of the governed. It strictly subordinates nations to supranational imperialism. It grows by violence and by subjugation. The record today is clear. There is no reasonable grounds today for misunderstanding that record. The political and social events that occur wherever so-called Marxist-Leninist governments rule are matters of fact, and those facts are readily ascertainable. They have been replicated in every country which has had the misfortune to experience a communist so-called revolution. The list of those countries is today very long. It includes the Soviet Union itself, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia. I almost forgot to mention the Ukraine and Belarusia, Albania, East Germany, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Cambodia, Laos, Yemen, so-called democratic Yemen, naturally, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and so forth, and so forth. In not one country where Marxist-Leninists have come to power have citizens been permitted free elections, free press, free trade unions, free speech, freedom to immigrate, or any other of the institutions associated with the political traditions of liberalism and democracy. Not one. Now, the greatest single obstacle, I believe, that we Americans have and that the West has more generally in dealing with the challenge, the threat posed by the Soviet Union to our institutions and our civilization is intellectual confusion that surrounds the nature of the Soviet Union, and especially intellectual confusion that surrounds Soviet tactics. Those tactics are exceedingly sophisticated and very effective. And in spite of the fact that the record is clear, we keep having problems understanding that record. And yet, let me say, that facing who they are and how their tradition and their goals relates to us is an absolute prerequisite to meeting the challenge. It's unpleasant even to think about it. It is extremely unpleasant to face the fact that the Soviet Union, which is a great European power, has established in our contemporary world a vast new empire that extends to all continents, which has from the very beginning grown by very skillful manipulation of symbols and the use of violence. It's even more unpleasant to face the fact that that power, which is so antithetical to our civilization and challenges us so profoundly, has experienced a really dramatic increase in military strength. The massive, unprecedented, unflagging Soviet military buildup, which they undertook while we were hoping that all they felt was insecure, has created what they themselves call a new world correlation of forces. That is, a new world balance of power. And if that new world balance of power does not feature Soviet military superiority, it is unquestionably characterized by a rough parity in most fields, with Soviet superiority in some. The meaning and the significance of this new correlation of forces is found less in the kind of painstaking estimates and counts of missiles and throw weights and tanks and MIRVs than it is in the Soviet foreign policy, which has emerged since the new correlation of forces developed. That new Soviet foreign policy is more menacing to the independence and peace of the world than at any time since Joseph Stalin moved to swallow up his neighboring Eastern European states during the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact. We and our friends have been very reluctant to acknowledge the extent, the intensity, or the violence of the Soviet challenge, doubtless because it's so unpleasant to think about, doubtless because it poses such difficult problems for us, problems that are difficult to manage, much less to resolve. And yet, in our times, in the period since this new correlation of forces emerged, Northern and Southern and Central Africa, the Middle East and Asia, Central and South America, the Caribbean, have become targets of Soviet-sponsored efforts at destabilization and takeover. The functional scope of Soviet expansionism has enlarged alongside its expanding geographical focus. Not only countries, but sea lanes, strategic minerals, space, and the culture itself have become operational objects of Soviet ambition. The Soviets appeal to our values and clothe their aggression in our symbols of liberation, seeking thereby to create situations in which respect by us for one of our own basic values, say non-intervention in the internal affairs of another state, seems to require that we stand by passively while one after another small, relatively helpless country succumbs to Marxist-Leninist tyranny and gets incorporated into the Soviet empire. That empire grows as communists bring resources and personnel drawn from all over the Soviet bloc to bear on those small, helpless countries, on the indigenous political disagreements and rivalries that exist in those countries. The pattern is by now discouragingly familiar. They choose a weak government, organize a national liberation front, add a terrorist campaign to disrupt order and provoke repression, They attempt to weaken an already weakened economy, and then they intensify the violence. You can see this as it's worked itself out in El Salvador. The brittle institutions of many, perhaps even most, third world governments will crumble rather readily under such strains. The skillful use of what used to be called fifth columns enables the Soviets to foment coups and civil wars under the guise of indigenous politics. Then we Americans, quite specifically, we in the West more generally, find it terribly difficult to justify playing any role because it seems too much like intervening in the internal affairs of another country. But that's not all. Once a transfer of power has been achieved and a dictatorship friendly to the Soviet Union established, they then seek to guarantee its so-called irreversibility by providing thousands and thousands and thousands of technicians, advisors, like the workers we found in Grenada, and troops, to prop up and guide the new government. Thus we see the extraordinary array of Soviet bloc military and civilian personnel in Nicaragua, Angola, Benin, Ghana, Congo, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Democratic Yemen, so-called, Syria, very recently, and, of course, Cuba. In those countries, one finds extraordinary international brigades accumulated from all over the Soviet bloc, from East Germany, from Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Vietnam, the PLO, Libya, from all parts of the Soviets' worldwide empire. Expertise is brought to bear on the weak institutions and relatively helpless people of the targeted third world country. Soviet government, we should be very clear, does not rely on the laws of history, as they call them, to bring about their revolutions. Neither do they rely on the laws of history to guarantee what they call their irreversibility. What they rely on instead is the deliberate manipulation of violence and a technology of deception. Soviet clients can always count on reliable supplies of arms and men. The pattern which I have just described can be observed in many countries in the world. One, which has recently been in our headlines, in which it could be clearly observed, was Grenada, that small spice island, so-called, 90 miles from the shores of Venezuela. From 1979 forward, Grenada had been ruled by a government that came to power in a Cuban Soviet-sponsored coup, overthrowing an elected government which held office before the coup. The government of Maurice Bishop, the man who led that coup on behalf of Cuban Soviet expansionism, was initially welcomed by Grenadians, probably because it promised that whatever else it did, it would hold elections and respect basic human rights. But those promises turned out to be more easily given than fulfilled. The promises were honored in the breach, as the government of Maurice Bishop attempted to impose on the people of Grenada a Castro-style dictatorship with Cuban and Soviet aid. Eventually, when Bishop sought to free himself from that Cuban-Soviet grip, he was himself arrested, as you know, by his Cuban-trained deputy, Bernard Cord, and shot in cold blood on the morning of October 19th, along with other members of his cabinet and political leaders. At least 18 deaths were confirmed, and we have, of course, now found a mass grave, which we think was the grave of those shot after the coup, and we estimate that there are some 40 persons in that mass grave. Among those were women and children. They were shot, of course, in a process that included no court, no trial, no judgment, just murder. Expressing horror at these, quote, brutal and vicious murders, Prime Minister Tom Adams of the nearby Barbados said that the division in the Caribbean now went, quote, far beyond ideological pluralism. It had become, he said, the difference between barbarians and human beings. In the wake of those murders, of Bishop and his cabinet, the so-called People's Revolutionary Army announced the dissolution of the government and the formation of a 16-member Revolutionary Military Council with General Hudson Austin as the nominal head. That new group, by the way, emphasized that it was not a government, and most of its neighbors believed it. They believed instead it was a gang of murderers who imposed an authentic reign of terror on the Grenadian people. As you know, it had decreed a 24-hour curfew, warning that violators would be shot on sight, had closed the airport, thereby entrapping nearly 1,000 U.S. citizens, every one of whom became thereby a potential hostage. Although it had given assurances that the airport would be opened on October 24th and the foreigners allowed to depart, it's interesting to note that that promise, too, was not kept, but instead violated. Grenada's neighbors had already become aware that they were targeted for subversion and destabilization. They had already begun to fear for their security. During the period of his rule, Maurice Bishop had permitted Grenada to be transformed into a base for the projection of Soviet and Cuban military power in this Western Hemisphere. The instruments of violence and deception accumulated in the Bishop tenure have, of course, now been revealed in the period following the action of the United States, the Barbados, Jamaica, and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. The size and sophistication of the armed forces of Grenada, Prime Minister Seaga of Jamaica pointed out, could be measured by a comparison with those of Jamaica. Grenada, he noted, having only 1/20th the population of Jamaica, had mobilized an army that was 1.5 times as large as the Jamaica Defense Force. Some of Grenada's neighbors have no army at all. Others had armies of less than 200 men. So we know that Grenada was not preparing to defend herself against her neighbors when she accumulated that extraordinary store of weapons and built that extraordinary airport, which was in the final stages of completion. The airport was but one of the new instruments for the projection of Soviet-Cuban power in the Caribbean. The powerful broadcasting station in Grenada was capable of reaching from one end of the Caribbean to the other, far exceeded the power of any broadcasting station in the region. And as Prime Minister Seaga himself again pointed out, it wouldn't have been a threat in the hands of normal people, but in the hands of the Cuban-Soviet surrogates who governed Grenada. It was quite clearly intended for use as an instrument for subverting its neighboring states, which, by the way, has its analog in Nicaragua, where very powerful broadcasting stations have been developed, which do indeed continuously beam their propaganda message to Costa Rica, Honduras, Salvador, and the neighboring states. The amounts of the weapons found in Grenada are quite literally mind-boggling. There was, as our newspapers have told us and as our intelligence has made clear, something over 7 very large warehouses filled with millions and millions of rounds of ammunition, a large number of other crates of Russian AK-47 submachine guns, heavy artillery capable of firing 2,000 rounds per minute, anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft installations, of great power. There were some 20,000 military uniforms found in Grenada. That's one military uniform for every 5 persons in Grenada. Prime Minister Adams of Barbados said there was no longer any mystery about what was going on at the Cuban-built airport at Port Salines. The airport had turned out already, we know, to be nothing less than a sophisticated military camp. It was almost entirely inhabited by Cubans. There were no Grenadans present. Grenada is, of course, an English-speaking island in the Caribbean, but all the signs in the airport and the surrounding enclave were in Spanish, none in English. Facilities were present in every room of all the structures there for the storage of arms, and there was absolutely no indication of any provision for normal commercial or civilian traffic. The installation, every installation, had places to hang rifles. The 6 warehouses packed with arms and other discoveries speak, said Prime Minister Adams, more eloquently than any words could, of a Grenada converted into a fortress and a base camp for hostile activities against its neighbors within the region. The discoveries which were made in the course of the action in Grenada included, as you have also read about in our newspapers, a large number of documents. Those documents have been described by leading Washington commentators as the largest and most valuable cache, as it were, of documents since the end of World War II. Those documents make clear that only the first stage of military buildup in Grenada had taken place. Continued acceleration through 1985 was foreseen in the 5 secret treaties that were found there. 3 of those secret treaties were with the Soviet Union, 1 with Cuba, and 1 with that nearby good neighbor, North Korea. North Korea, in a fit of neighborliness, had alone agreed to supply $12 million worth of arms. Those secret treaties also provide for the covert supply of arms to Grenada from the Soviet Union and provide for their transshipment through Cuba, a pattern that's also being followed all over Central America. The arms included millions of rounds of, the arms that were promised, that is, included millions of rounds of ammunition and sniper rifles, mortars, grenades, heavy personnel carriers, and so forth. And they provided for training large numbers of Grenadans in the Soviet Union. You know, in the United Nations, people say that the U.S. action with our Caribbean allies and friends in going into Grenada was the equivalent to the use of force by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan or in Eastern Europe. Let me say that there is a parallel to be drawn between Grenada and Afghanistan, a very meaningful parallel. Just as Maurice Bishop was murdered in Grenada because he finally tried to free himself just a bit from the Soviet stranglehold, so was Mohammed Daoud murdered in Afghanistan, and after him, Hafizullah Amin, that is, 2 successive rulers of Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion finally took place. They too had discovered that they discovered the hard way, that the only thing more dangerous than embracing the Soviet bear is trying to break loose from its deadly grip. They too learned that the price of trying to break loose is death. This and this alone is the parallel between Grenada and Afghanistan. The differences are many. The biggest difference of all is surely that the people of Grenada have been spared the cruel fate of the people of Afghanistan. people of Grenada had already experienced what it was like to fall prey to those who specialize in gaining power through subversion and terror, and then consolidating totalitarian control. It was a hard lesson. It's always a hard lesson. The world does not learn easily this lesson. In the United Nations, the week after the Security Council had passed a resolution describing the rescue mission undertaken in conformity with the requests of the Governor General of Grenada and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States as a flagrant violation of international law, the General Assembly undertook to act in the same vein. It's often said about the United Nations that it's terribly important to the world because it provides an opportunity for the discussion of all the issues in the world by all the countries in the world. But on the occasion that Nicaragua and Cuba brought the complaint against the United States action in Grenada before the General Assembly, they also were able to pass a gag rule that prohibited the discussion of the issue before the vote. That the gag rule was not passed by quite as large a margin as the resolution, which once again condemned us as engaged in a flagrant violation of international law. Repeatedly, since that vote, I have been asked, public places, private places, what I thought, how I felt about the UN action with regard to the American action in Grenada. I have said that I thought it was particularly ironic that that organization, which was founded in the wake of a great war against tyrants, namely World War II, which was made up from the moment of its birth of a good many nations who had been liberated by force from the troops and the quisling governments of tyrants, should deplore the rescue of the people of Grenada from a small band of murderous tyrants. I have suggested that some of our friends have very short memories. But what I have really felt like is perhaps best expressed by a story. A story about a government official who went off his rocker and was sent to an asylum. Under intensive psychiatry, he seemed to cure very rapidly. And so the time came for his discharge. And as the doctor handed him his discharge papers, he asked, "Well, what are your plans now?" And the discharged patient replied, "I'm thinking about being an ambassador to the United Nations. Then, on the other hand, I may decide to just remain a tea kettle." Thank you very much.